Now, if you think that the recent labour unrest at the various platinum and gold mines around South Africa is really about wage demands, you would be mistaken. While many perceive South African labour to be poorly remunerated, the reality is that South Africa has solid wage growth and a lower tax rate. In theory, we in fact should be richer. The real reason for much of the frustration is that the cost of living has simply gotten out of hand. And while everybody hears the plight of the rock drill operators, these miners represent a broader problem for all of us. That's the angle of this week's Finweek cover story. Here to share their views today, Simona Levet and Jessica Hubbard, both Finweek journalists, and joining us on the line from Cape Town, Illana Nelzer, consultant at 8020. Mark, I'll start off with you. This, of course, the Marikana saga and the implications it's had for the broader mining sector has really gripped South Africa. It's cast a spotlight on the country, but an interesting angle you've chosen to take here. You know, what South Africans, ordinary South Africans, have in common with these rock drill operators. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, I think we were really intrigued by this idea. I think everybody's been really fascinated by the story. They've been caught up in a lot of the rhetoric around wage demands and essentially, you know, often you follow the discussions on Twitter, for instance, and everybody talks about slave labor, levels of remuneration. But we kind of view it a little bit differently. We argue that actually South African miners are quite well remunerated compared to the international counterparts, and there's a caveat to that, but we can get into it, but we genuinely believe that it's not so much about the wage demands that's creating a lot of this frustration, and I think Illana carries a similar view to this, but we look at it and we actually say it's actually just the cost of living has accelerated faster than the income growth in South Africa, and we know that income growth is going to slow going forward. Cost of living is not slowing down. We've seen all these stories about the debt collectors in and around the Rustenburg platinum mines. You've got guys that are taking R1,000 a month and having to repay 11,000 rand. That is where the problem is, that it's a frustration that they've got themselves so far in debt. The cost of living is overtaking them, and while everybody hears the rock drill operator as the sort of poster boy for this particular environment, the reality is this is a problem that goes into all of the other the broader consumer. And I think that we've seen this as the spark point, but we genuinely believe that this is not so much about wage demands. This is an issue that relates specifically to what's happening in the broader consumer market.
Well, let's go to Illana, who's standing by on the line. Illana Nelzer from 8020. Thank you so much for joining us today, Illana. Do you share the same sentiment that it's the cost of living that is really the underlying problem here in South Africa? And I suppose, what would be the solution? I mean, who's responsible for it? Is the cost of living a lot more expensive in South Africa relative to other countries?
Well, it's an interesting question, and one probably that so many of us are looking for answers for. I think there are lots of dimensions to explore, and the one critical dimension that was highlighted by a couple of researchers is the switch away from free government provision of services towards private provision of services, and that's possibly driven by government not being able to deliver to the quality that people require. And the categories that come to mind are things like education and medical spend. So that can be part of the issue. Of course, we're not completely up to speed with what consumers are doing with the money that they borrow, and probably needs a lot more research in that area. When you ask people using surveys, they give you all the good answers that you would hope to hear. They tell you that they're investing in housing, in education, in other good things, but sometimes we suspect that that's not the case. So it's a complex issue, and there are probably lots of factors driving consumer spend in different categories.
Yeah, but if you do delve into the, I suppose, non-discretionary items, the items that most of us have to pay on a day-to-day basis, you know, looking at a survey Finweek did, the cost of a litre of petrol has risen by 239% in the past 10 years. We know that the cost of food continues to go up and will continue to go up. We've seen that drought in the US, and that will start feeding into food prices. Looking at the latest inflation number, education rising by 9% year on year, far above inflation right now. So these are many costs that people can't afford not to pay. And, you know, ultimately you have to educate your child to help improve not only their livelihood, but the ultimate livelihood and the productivity of the workforce in South Africa.
Absolutely, absolutely. So these are critical issues. Again, as I say, we don't know how much of that expenditure is being funded by credit. You know, we don't know whether there's been a shift in expenditure patterns, as I say, sort of away from free provision from the state towards private sector. We just kind of don't have good ongoing data on that. We'll wait to see the results of StatSA's income and expenditure survey. That will be quite interesting to analyse. But these are questions that I think we're all sitting with.
Yeah. Illana, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Illana Nelzer from 8020. Simona, let me throw to you and let's open up the conversation around productivity in South Africa, because you can have wage growth, perhaps not of 22%, but you can have wage growth if it's matched by increase in productivity. But in South Africa, according to AdCorp, productivity levels sitting at a low that we haven't seen for the past 46 years. This is very concerning. And the question is, how do you make the labour force more productive?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the issue about productivity is an immense one, and it's not just the workplace productivity that we need to be concerned with. It's actually also the public sector levels of productivity. For example, if you have a look at where we've seen the most growth in wages, it's actually been in the public sector. And I think one of the issues that I've identified is that the anger, I think, is somewhat misplaced. At the end of the day, it wasn't Business South Africa who promised better services, a better life for all in '94. It was the government. And what we're faced with now is that we've got all these implicit taxes that consumers are facing because that service delivery and that productivity actually hasn't come through in the public sector.
Do we have to give a government a little bit of leeway when it comes to how long they need to improve the infrastructure that is needed to support a country with a growing middle class and a lot more people being included in the broader economy?
I would disagree with that. I think we've given the government enough leeway already, and families of all classes, so lower class, middle class, upper class, we're all being affected by the government inefficiencies and inadequacies. So for example, we're having to pay for private security companies to take care of our safety. We're having to pay for private medical schemes to make up for poor state hospitals.
Private education added to that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I think those indirect taxes are really taking a toll, and we're having,
let's just add that to the table this
as
week.
well. So
Yeah.
if we didn't have to pay for all of those things, which should be paid for by our taxes, we would be more equipped to deal with the average expenses of food, petrol, etc.
It's interesting because you also, talk about an example of Brazil and what the Brazilian government is doing to reduce the cost of living there.
Yeah, I think that is a problem. We're an inefficient country. I think we're inefficient in labour, we're inefficient in a lot of our infrastructure. Costs of moving goods around South Africa, it's just like prohibitively expensive. And I think that we're running out of patience with a government that has promised a lot. And I mean, the rollout of the infrastructure rollout has been promised for a long time now. We're tired of hearing power stations will come online, ports will come online. We've almost reached a point where we actually now need to bite the bullet and invest in this country, because I think the problem is that.
But who? I mean, private sector, individuals.
Well, I think government has earmarked the money. The money is there. And I think that for us, that seems to be the problem, is that nobody's prepared to actually bite the bullet and get these commitments through. And I think that when that does happen, it will start to reduce the cost of living for individuals. And because I think we've got to accept that there isn't going to be this income growth. We've had fantastic income growth. We can't lower taxes a hell of a lot more. I mean, there's been real decreases in the overall level of taxation. But it's these indirect taxations that are ultimately burning.